This is a chance to talk, and it's precious. And the day may be coming when that becomes dangerous. And the loss of the free market is a grievous thing that will impoverish us all. But that will be connected, perforce as it must be, by the loss of our constitutional freedoms too. And that means that the work we do here, first of all, we should savor it while we have it. But second, we should understand and get ready to fight to protect it. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Arnn. And now on to our main speaker of the evening. Daniel Hannan is a writer and journalist and has been conservative member of the European Parliament for Southeast England since 1999. He writes extensively for newspapers around the world, such as the Wall Street Journal, and currently authors a blog for the Daily Telegraph that you can read online. His latest book is The New Road to Serfdom, a letter of warning to America. Very appropriate. And we will have copies available for you to purchase of The New Road to Serfdom out in the foyer immediately following this evening. Please take advantage of that, and Mr. Hannan will sign your copy. Daniel Hannan is also in great demand as a speaker. My husband and I had the privilege of hearing him last year in London, and it was a fantastic evening. So on this topic of the new road to serfdom, lessons to learn from European policy, please welcome our speaker, Daniel Hannan.
Anita, thank you for your kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin with a story that seems apt to our present discontents. Almighty God decides that he's had enough of human wickedness. He decides he's going to send a flood and start all over again. And in order to do this, he's going to find one good man. So he sends his archangel down to this world. And the archangel approaches Noah and he says, Noah, the Lord commands that you build an ark, that you hew it of gopher wood, that you build many rooms therein, and that you pitch it within and without with pitch. And Noah replies, gopher wood? Oh no, I couldn't do that. It would contravene the EU's Sustainable Habitat Directive. Gabriel carries on. He says, the Lord commands that of length it be 500 cubits, and of height it be 50 cubits, and of width 30 cubits. And Noah says, cubits? I can't work in cubits. I can't even work in feet and inches. It would be against the EU's metrication directive. Gabriel says, the Lord commands that you fill it with 2 of every living creature, each male and female after its kind, of cattle 2 after their kind, and of fowl 2 after their kind, and of every living thing that crawleth on the earth, each after its kind, male and female. And Noah says, haven't you heard of the EU's Transport of Live Animals Directive? Well, Gabriel is very puzzled by this, and he returns to his maker and he says, Lord, what is this EU whereof thy children speak? And God replies, verily, the EU is the cause for which I'm sending the flood. Well, my friends, he is sending the flood now. The waters are rising in Brussels even as we sit enjoying our dinner here in Atlanta. Today will be remembered as the day that the project collapsed, 27th of October, 2011. Now, the collapse doesn't always happen overnight. It's like Wile E. Coyote in those Roadrunner cartoons. You go off the end of the cliff and your feet are still whirling round until you look down and you realize what has happened. But the reality, if you look at what has just been agreed in this summit, is that we have run out of road. We're off the cliff. There was a debt crisis in Europe. Governments were living beyond their means. They were encouraging consumption, but they were not producing. And they were bridging the gap with debt. The EU's solution is more debt, unprecedented debt, €1 trillion, and a literally unimaginable sum. Our minds are not designed to comprehend figures of such magnitude. The problem was jamming divergent economies into a single monetary policy. The problem was excessive political integration, too much centralization. The EU is solving it with more integration. If monetary union didn't work, let's have economic union, let's have fiscal union, let's have common economic governance. If it hasn't worked, let's do it twice as hard. Well, just stand back. It's always the same pattern. Whenever you have one of these summits, the markets spike for about 48 hours before people realize that none of the fundamental problems has been addressed. And none of the fundamental problems here has been addressed. You cannot apply a common monetary policy to widely differing economies. That was just as true before the summit as it is today. And let's just focus for a second on this extraordinary figure of €1 trillion, which is going to be somehow magicked out of the air. Two questions immediately arise. First of all, who has €1 trillion? Right? I mean, if any government around the world had €1 trillion lying around, don't you think they would have spent it in the last 3 years, given the condition of the world economy? So from whom are we borrowing? The answer, of course, is we're borrowing from our children and our grandchildren. We are freighting future generations with an unprecedented level of debt. Even more immediate arises the question, what's the collateral for a figure like that, right? Who stands guarantor to a debt of €1 trillion? Well, in theory, the answer is the European Central Bank. In reality, the European Central Bank is already so weighted down with junk debt from stricken Eurozone economies that on any normal definition, it is already a bad bank. So who stands behind the ECB? The taxpayers of the Eurozone, including the taxpayers of Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece, right? Now just think about this. The guarantors are the same people as the debtors. No new money is coming in. It's all just being repackaged. The people borrowing are the same as the people lending. Now, as I understand it, you have a word for that on this side of the Atlantic. It's called a Ponzi scheme, and people go to prison for doing it. That's what I mean by running out of road. Now, why is it that I am burdening you with our problems? Well, they're going to become your problems too, because this is a road which you are following us down. You know, John Winthrop, your countryman and mine, the guy who preached the City of the Hill sermon, or the eyes of all people should be upon us, he made another sermon which is much less well known, and it contained a line where he said, "A good name for a child serves as a thread around the thumb." It gives us something to live up to. Now, that's a pretty tough thing if your name, as mine is Daniel. He was a hard act to follow, and it's very difficult for anyone to aspire to follow him in wisdom, in sanctity, or indeed in speaking truth to power. But it did make me very familiar with a story that again seems very appropriate to Europe's present calamity. You remember the story of Belshazzar's feast? A king is there and he's having a party and he celebrates and he asks for the gold from the Temple of Jerusalem to be brought forth, and he starts toasting in the gold all of the gods of wood and metal and so on. And then the writing appears on the wall in a finger that moves and then disappears. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And nobody can read it. None of the great magicians can understand what's been written. The Queen Mother says, your father knew a guy, this Jewish man, Daniel. Call him in. Well, my biblical namesake comes along, and he says with words that apply perfectly to our present rulers, he interprets the writing. He says, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Ponder that phrase, weighed in the balances and found wanting. It turns out that the wealth we thought we had wasn't there. It had been fabricated. It wasn't backed by anything. All through the Western world, And this is your problem just as much as it's ours. We, and when I say we, I mean the people in government, the people in central banks, the people in academia, have encouraged this bizarre notion that you become rich by spending more. Now, that is, I was talking over dinner to Larry about the danger of half education, the danger of being just educated enough to think you're smarter than everybody else. You almost have to be a trained economist to believe that it is possible to spend your way out of debt, to borrow your way out of recession. And yet this is the ruling orthodoxy of your Federal Reserve, of our Bank of England, of the European Central Bank. And what we have seen in the past 4 years is the inevitable end of applying that policy. If you carry on spending more and more without producing anything, and bridging the gap by getting deeper and deeper into debt, there comes a terrible reckoning. And rather than admit that, our policymakers have done everything they can to keep the bubble inflated. The air is trying to rush out. What is supposed to happen when you have a decade of easy credit, when you've had central banks the world over keeping interest rates too low for too long, what is supposed to happen is that there's a correction. That the malinvestments of the past 10 years are put right so that growth can begin again on a more realistic and sober basis. But what we saw in Brussels yesterday and what we're seeing here is a last-ditch attempt to stop that happening, to postpone the inevitable. You know what? It's like a drunk postponing his hangover by remaining drunk. It doesn't work, and it makes the hangover worse when you eventually get there. If we dealt with the Greek crisis in 2009, the whole thing would have cost about 60 billion euros. Now 100 billion have been gone, and no one thinks that the underlying problems have been solved. Of all of the lines of John Maynard Keynes which are quoted, perhaps the most common was his observation that practical men who think of themselves as being free of all ideologies, are in practice the slaves of some defunct economist. Never has that observation been so true as today, with Keynes as the defunct economist in question. What would have been regarded as a totally cranky, bizarre way of looking at the world until he came along has become the prevalent orthodoxy among intellectual circles, but not in the wider countries. If these bailouts and these nationalizations had been put to a referendum here, or in Britain, or anywhere else, they would have been rejected. What we see, yet again, is that people are wiser than their leaders. Now, the reason that this has happened is precisely because the leaders have been able to escape the critical scrutiny of their electorates. Larry quoted Madison's observation that this was the first truly representative government, and it was. But with every shift in power, from the 50 states to Washington, from the elected representative to the federal czar, from the citizen to the government, it becomes less representative. And as it becomes less representative, it becomes more prey to vested interests, to lobbying, to the big corporations of left or right who stand in the way of the majority interest. I saw some of the Occupy people in a US city where I was yesterday. And well, I was talking to some people from Northern California at the table. This was in San Francisco. They were occupying San Francisco. We are the 99%, except obviously it was California, so it was somos el 99%, because obviously if you were in the majority there, you wouldn't be speaking English. And you know, I wanted to say to them, as I do to their equivalent, we have an English offshoot, it's brilliant. They're called Occupy the Stock Exchange. But being kind of hapless and hopeless lefties, they couldn't actually get to the stock exchange, so they instead decided to occupy St. Paul's Cathedral on grounds that it's kind of vaguely near to the stock exchange. I mean, in both cases, you want to shake these people and say, you have picked the wrong target, comrades. You know, I totally understand why you are angry about these bank bailouts. Everyone should be angry about them. It was outrageous that ordinary taxpayers were sent the bill in order to rescue some very wealthy individuals from the consequences of their own errors. Of course, you don't have to be on the far left to see this for what it is, which is taking from the poor to give to the rich. But whatever you call it, it is not capitalism. In a capitalist system, bad banks would have failed. Their profitable operations would have been bought by their more successful competitors. Some bondholders, some shareholders would have lost money, maybe some depositors. But the taxpayer would not have contributed a penny. You guys, I wanted to say to them, you guys are in the wrong place. You should be occupying the Fed. You should be occupying the Bank of England. You should be protesting against the people who decreed this outrageous policy, designed as it is to worsen our plight and lengthen the recession. If you wanted to do all the things since the Lehman's collapse to make things worse, quantitative easing, ultra-low interest rates, subsidies, nationalizations, everything designed to keep the zombie banks malodorously wandering around when they should be collapsing, to keep the poor businesses in play when they should be being taken over by better ones. We have ticked every box. We've run out of road. We're Wile E. Coyote over the edge of the cliff. Now, I said that this happens when government becomes remote. And this is what might save you. This is why the EU is so much further down this road than the United States. But we can see you in our rear view mirror. And under this present administration, you're doing your best to catch up. But the genius of this republic, the sublime principle that actuated it, was that glorious, let's call it Jeffersonian ideal, that decisions should be taken as closely as possible to the people that they affect. And that's what has served to keep the government small and the citizen big. It's what's served to remind your politicians that they are servants and not rulers, up until very recently. Now, to see why that matters, to see what the alternative is, look across the Atlantic. If the US Constitution was designed around the basis of maximum dispersal, maximum devolution of power, the European Union was designed from the opposite imperative, maximum concentration of power. The EU has the misfortune to be a child of its time, whereas your union was born out of a popular revolt against a remote and unpopular government, and the sympathy of your patriot leaders was therefore with the maximum dispersal of power. The EU came out of the Second World War, and people were therefore determined to amalgamate the countries and to make their rulers immune to public opinion, invulnerable, because in their eyes, public opinion was a very dangerous thing. It led to demagogues and fascism and war. And so they vested supreme power in the hands of technocrats, of experts who were immune to the ballot box. The supreme power in the European Union is held by 27 unelected commissioners. Now, you'll have spotted by now that they're not really that expert. I mean, if these are the experts, we're in trouble, right? It's precisely because we've elevated in Europe the standing apparat, the permanent functionariat, over representative democracy, that the state has grown. If budgets are set not by elected legislators who are answerable to the taxpayer, but by people who are themselves part of the executive and therefore personal beneficiaries from state spending, budgets are going to grow. If you shift power from people who have to go back regularly to the voters and explain what they've done with their money to people who don't, budgets are going to grow. And the further power is shifted from the general population, the more you open the doors to all of the vested interests who would never win in an open ballot. And that's why I say Europe is in front of you, but you are beginning to catch us up. If I look at the policies being pursued by this administration, they are not a set of random initiatives that happen to have been lashed together. They amount to a comprehensive Europeanization package. European healthcare, European welfare, European daycare, European college education, European carbon taxes, European nuclear disarmament, European foreign policy. I was asked on a radio show here, what did I think about this theory of Barack Obama being born in Kenya? I said, no way, he was obviously born in Brussels. And I tell you, my friends, I am therefore inhabiting your future, or at least the future towards which your present rulers are intent on taking you. I've been a member of the European Parliament for 12 years. I've seen what happens when these policies of tax and regulation and government control and telling the private sector what they're allowed to pay people and all the rest of it, I've seen what happens when they are taken to their logical conclusion. You are not going to like it. Don't take my word for it. Look at what has happened in the past 48 hours in Europe, where the money has run out, our treasuries are empty, our credit is exhausted, and the system is in collapse. Why do I come here and tell you these things as an Englishman? Why do I come here and hymn the praises of a republic that was, after all, born out of a popular revolt against the British Crown? Well, I'll tell you. I think we are heirs to a common heritage and a common tradition. And this was something that was very much in the minds of your patriot leaders at the time of the division. They didn't believe that they were dreaming up a set of arbitrary and abstract freedoms from scratch. They saw themselves as part of a tradition that stretched back deep into our past, back through the Glorious Revolution, back through the English Civil War, back even before the Magna Carta, to that folk right of Anglo-Saxon common law. This extraordinary idea that law does not emanate from the government, but that rather the government is subject to a law that comes from the people. That the state is not the source of authority, but that the people are sovereign. That is my country's greatest export, our supreme contribution to the happiness of mankind. The glorious idea that laws ought not to be passed, nor taxes raised, except by elected representatives. And that vision found its purest and most sublime expression in the old courthouse in Philadelphia. Now, I've seen in the country where this vision was first adumbrated, I've seen what happens when it's put into retreat. As power has passed in my country from Parliament to the standing bureaucracy, and as sovereignty has passed from the British people to the European Union, I've seen what happens when you lose those freedoms. I'm terrified to think that it might be happening here, in the one place I'd always looked to be the secure vessel of liberty. I mentioned that I came here from Northern California yesterday, like some of the people in the audience. And there, an irresistible metaphor struck me. There I was where most of the wine in the United States is grown. Of course, those vineyards came from European stock. Originally, they had been, the various varieties of grape had been introduced from French and Italian and Spanish vineyards. Towards the end of the 19th century, there was a plague in Europe, a blight called phylloxera. The vineyards were wiped out. And in order to resuscitate European viticulture, in order to bring back new cuttings, the wine growers of Europe had to come to California and bring back the cousins of the grapes whose ancestral stock had been wiped out in Europe. Now, I see something similar. I used to dream of a similar thing happening in politics. What I've stood for since I became an elected representative in Britain has been a restoration of our traditional British freedoms. Devolution of power, direct election of public officials, localism, devolution of power, all of the things that you take for granted here, all of those wonderful ideas that we exported and that we've now lost in the mother country. Imagine how they would have felt, those European wine growers, if when they finally got to California, they discovered that the aphids had got there first, and that the eggs were on the leaf, and that there were no vines to take home with them. That's my fear when I see you going down this road, when I see this administration repeating all the mistakes that we've made on our side of the Atlantic. I don't say that you've got everything right in this country. I don't say that the US is perfect. I don't say that we've got everything wrong in Britain. But it is bizarre that the bits of the European system you are intent on copying are the bits that have most spectacularly and obviously failed. You deserve better, my friends. You deserve better, and we expect better. Let me finish by making a plea to you, and I make it as your kinsman and as your friend and as your ally, but also as a common inheritor of that shared patrimony of the English-speaking peoples. Don't repeat our mistake. Cleave fast to the vision of your founders. Treasure the inheritance you have from your parents and pass it on intact to your children. Okay, time for questions. Anita, you'll wave at me when we've run out of time, will you? Yes. Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you so much for those enlightening remarks.
A brilliant question, thank you very much.
I'd like to know how many of you there are in the EU Parliament and what your opposition says when you tell them the kind of thing that you've told us tonight.
We are very few in the European Parliament. I am working to put myself out of a job, by which I mean that I am working towards the day when there are no more British members of the European Parliament because Britain has left the European Union. Now, you can imagine that that doesn't make me the most popular person in the European Parliament. It's one thing to impose a term limit on yourself, it's another to try and take some of the other swine with you as you go. But I think we are in the majority among the peoples. There is this enormous mismatch between people and elites in Europe, as here and as everywhere else. Every time there is a referendum on closer European integration, in any country, in Ireland, in France, in the Netherlands, let alone in Britain, where they don't dare put the question, there is a massive vote against giving Brussels any more powers. And the response in the European Union is always the same. Carry on regardless. People didn't understand the question. They didn't really mean it. I'm reminded of that eerie poem of Bertolt Brecht's which finishes, "Wouldn't it therefore be easier to dissolve the people and elect another in their place?" That could be the official slogan of the European Union. So I like to think we're popular in our constituencies, but in the European Parliament, well, I can best answer that by quoting your American writer Upton Sinclair. It is very difficult to make a man understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it.
It doesn't seem like anybody would have been surprised when you had the European Monetary Union if countries were able to build up as much debt as they did. So that's why they actually put some rules in place about the allowable debt. But so what happened in terms of the fact that they decided they just weren't going to pay any attention to those?
Well, the rules were never observed. And not only were the rules not observed, the bailouts that we have seen to date are utterly illegal. I don't just mean that they are not provided for in the treaties. I mean they are expressly prohibited. Article 126 says it is illegal for one member state or for the EU to take on the debts of another. And nobody in Brussels really denies that. If you point out to them that what they're doing is against the dots and commas of their own treaties, they say, politics is a lovely phrase that one of them used, politics is in front of the legislation on this. We'll make up the rules after the event, retrospectively, to justify what we've done. The crazy thing about this is that they are prepared to pay any price in order to keep the project going, because they personally have invested so much political capital in it. And that price is going to be extraordinary. We can already see what it is for the peoples of Greece and Ireland and Portugal, That price is poverty, deflation, and emigration on a scale not seen before. And for the peoples of Austria and Germany and Finland and the other contributor countries, that price is massive tax rises. All rather than admit the mistake. All to save face. These Eurocrats have the most expensive faces in the history of Europe since that of Helen of Troy, which was said to launch 1,000 ships. Rather than admit that they were wrong, they are prepared, I almost said they are prepared to pay any price. They personally will not pay any price because, as Eurocrats, they are exempt from national taxation. But their peoples will pay a terrible price.
To what extent do you think the fundamental problem here is an ethical problem? The new serfdom being indebtedness. As you know, the Bible warns against indebtedness. It doesn't prohibit, but it warns. The debtor will be the slave of the creditor. And one of the things that Keynes and the Fabian socialists did was to try to teach this in the school system, to get people to believe that there's nothing really wrong with borrowing. There's no reason not to. And honoring your word, you see, and prudence have become less important as ethical issues. And so my question, I guess, is this a fundamental long-term thing that we need to work at through the schools to get control of our indebtedness? It's a mindset, it's a worldview, and as educators, we have to teach this. And of course, I don't have to tell you, most of the teaching comes in the home.
Sure.
And what has happened to homes? What has happened to families? I could go on and on about this, but what I'm trying to say is we look at this as just a problem for legislators or the wealthy, the rich, the Wall Streets, but no, it's a fundamental problem for society. The whole area of greed, wanting what's not yours.
Right. Well, first of all, that ethical education has to come from you, from people in families, from people as private citizens. It should not come from governments. Governments do things very badly. They were no good at building cars. They were no good at operating airlines. They were no good at installing telephones, and they are no good at instilling virtues. They're very good at nationalizing morality and excluding virtue because they push the private sphere into the corners. But they can't promote these things, and it's a dangerous politician who believes he can. But on the substance of your question, there are different kinds of debt. There is borrowing in order to invest, because you're starting a business or whatever, and there is borrowing for the sake of consumption. And our problem throughout the West is that we have been borrowing and consuming without any equivalent production. And the worst offenders have been the governments. You're right. This is something, this policy that, on which every Western economy has operated since the war, where you deliberately manipulate interest rates so as to punish thrift and reward profligacy, flies in the face not just of biblical teaching, flies in the face of every classical philosopher, of every classical writer, of every monotheistic religion, and of common sense. It's this phenomenon of the half-educated again, the people who have colonized our central banks and our academia. But the one lot of people who profit most from it are the governments themselves. What's happening now in Britain? What's happening here with the quantitative easing, and what's going to happen now in Europe, because the only way that they're going to finance this trillion euros is through printing money, is a massive undeclared tax on the people who have done the right thing. The phenomenon of inflation is a way for the state to transfer revenue from savers to itself. And the reason politicians do it is because a country which has a big deficit can close that deficit in one of three ways. It can reduce spending, it can raise taxes, or it can inflate the debt away. Politicians are always attracted to option 3 because they believe that they can get away with it. The voters won't blame them, that the voters will see inflation as some kind of natural force that the politician had to deal with rather than as a consequence of the politician's own action. You know what? People have seen through that. They're taking us for fools. I don't think that people are going to fall for that. We know perfectly well that if you print more money, if you increase the supply of anything, other things being equal, you cheapen its value. And I think the governments are behaving outrageously. They're being unmanly in that they're refusing to admit why they're doing it, and they are hurting the people who have done all the right things. So there's a lady there, and then there's a lady at the table right at the front here, if you haven't seen her, the microphone wielders. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Quick question. Thank you for coming over here and educating us. Short of scrapping the whole system, short of just getting up there and having a capitalism revolt, what steps, if you had a chance to talk to this administration, would you talk would be the most impactful immediately?
Well, I do think you have to change the system. I mean, you guys here had a very good system, and a number of peculiarities of the American system of democracy. Primaries, term limits, recall votes, ballot and referendum procedures, dispersal of power, states' rights. These are all bullocks against the power of an overweening state. And the danger here is that people are trampling over them. The extraordinary thing of having a regulatory czar, I find the czar bit of the title even more scary than the regulatory bit. I mean, here was a country I thought that was founded on the premise of getting away from all that sort of thing, but we'll leave that to one side. We need to copy that. Or rather, we need to re-import these ideas. When I make these arguments in Britain about why we need elected sheriffs and why we need local sales taxes, people say, you're trying to Americanize our system. I say, yeah, and where did they get it from? What I want is to repatriate our revolution. But I come back to saying this, the people are ahead of the politicians. And what happened, as far as I understand it, at the midterms last year, was exactly what's supposed to happen. That groups of concerned citizens, seeing that their elected leaders were not safeguarding their freedoms and were conniving at an unconstitutional expansion of state power, took the defense of their freedom into their own hands and began the process of changing the complexion of their legislature so that it was more in tune with public opinion. Perfect. That's how the system is supposed to work. Your congressmen are not the owners of your liberties. They are their temporary and contingent stewards. And if they're not doing their job properly, you change them.
Do you sounding petty? I know you believe or give President Obama the benefit of the doubt that he intends well, but this Occupy Wall Street and other things, there are rumors that it's infiltrated by Marxists and communists and labor unions and all that stuff. And I read Saul Alinsky one time, and he said that the thing to do is to create enough chaos that people will turn to government for all their solutions. Could you see that motivation behind this?
When I say that I think he's acting from principle, I do believe that. The worst, as I said over dinner, Susan, the worst atrocities in politics are carried out by people who are convinced of their own rectitude. The most dangerous thing in politics is the man who is so convinced that he has a monopoly of the truth that he regards anyone who disagrees with him intellectually as morally deficient, and therefore someone to be trampled over. The shyster in politics, the guy who's just gone in to better himself financially, he realizes very quickly when the game is up and he gets out without having done the terrible damage that the wrong ideologue does. Now, I was talking to Anita earlier about the parallels between the second Roosevelt and the present president. And those parallels, in a way, are obvious. They both take over at a time of economic crisis, what looks like a failure of capitalism. They both bring these enormous democratic majorities in their wake in both houses. They are both convinced that the crisis was caused by the inactivity of the previous lot, and that, therefore, almost anything they do is justified, because they alone are trying to rescue the little guy. And that, in their minds, justifies sidelining the legislature, ignoring the Constitution, expanding the executive. Obama hasn't gone so far as to try and pack the Supreme Court, but only because he saw somebody else try and fail to do it before. I'm sure that all of those things are done by people who think that they're rescuing the country. But that's why your founders had the genius to design a system where they were constrained, where that wasn't enough. You were not just answerable to your conscience, you were answerable to your constituents. That's why I come back to saying it is the most precious thing. We all take things for granted. It's human nature. And I'm sure that a number of people in this room take for granted the unique properties of US democracy in all its extraordinary and myriad forms. But the most brilliant thing was the way your founders, without any first-hand experience of it, foresaw the dangers inherent in the centralization of power. Thomas Jefferson said, in a country this size, if we had a single government, its members at such a distance and out from under the eye of their constituents could not but give in to corruption, plunder, and waste. My goodness, he was right about that. Look at the European Union. He could have been describing it. Amazing. It's come true. We now see empirically what he knew intuitively. And that's why the solution here, every time I come back to it, disperse power. You make government more efficient, you get rid of duplication, you make budgets smaller, you make people happier.
With what's going on in Europe, and I'm over here, do you think that the stage is being set for another world war?
No. I think that the sort of knockdown justification of the EU was always that they were stopping war. And that in their minds, just like I was saying to Susan, that in their minds justified anything. You're corrupt? Yeah, but we're stopping war. It's undemocratic? Yeah, but we're stopping war. You know, and they almost literally would say that. There was an extraordinary and terrifying moment in the run-up to the French and Dutch referendums on the European Constitution 6 years ago now, when the commissioner in charge, who was a Swedish lady called Mrs. Wallström, went to the to celebrate or to mark the anniversary of the liberation of a concentration camp in Theresienstadt. It's now called Terezin in the Czech Republic. And she actually said, the people who are against the European Constitution should come here and see where that road leads. Now, that is the really terrifying moral fervor. You know, anyone who disagrees with me basically wants another Holocaust. Well, the good news is that she was wrong, because, you know, people did vote no, and there has, as far as I know, been no reversion to mass murder or genocide in Europe. But the terrifying certainty of saying something like that, anyone who disagrees with me is basically an apologist for Nazism. And this is what's kept the thing going. Actually, in the sense that bourgeois democracy had spread around Europe, we had solved the problem of war in Europe by about 1960. The European Union could at that stage have given itself a medal and retired. But do you ever know a bureaucracy that volunteers its own disbandment? Having got that far, they had to keep finding new justifications for their existence and for their salaries. And even now, they still use this. I mean, the German Chancellor said it yesterday in her speech to the Bundestag. You know, if the euro fails, we might be back to war in Europe. And come on. I did a debate about a month ago against two German Europhiles. And they both used that argument, and they did it in the way that the elites in Germany always do. They use this very elliptical language. Oh, we mustn't awaken the demons of the past. We mustn't go back to the wicked parts of our history. And it was a basically German audience I was speaking to. I said, you know, they've said what the German elites always say, and they've done it in this indirect language that they always use. I said, you know why? Because they can't say it plainly, or you would see how utterly absurd it is. Let me say it plainly, and you will see how silly it is. We have to give all this money to the Greek government because otherwise we might find ourselves invading Poland. It is a totally preposterous idea, and happily the German people, in a sturdy, common-sense way, have seen through it. They can spot a racket when they see one. Sure, okay, one more.
Yes, our problems are many, and we're reminded, like you mentioned, the days of Noah, and we think about the days of Nineveh when the defiant Jonah was sent. but I must say that I agree with Herman Cain that we need to talk about solutions. And our God tells us that there is a solution. He says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure there was a question, although I agreed with your answer. But I will just add this. The most important virtue, I think, in politics, after 12 years of being a publicly elected official, is an awareness that you are passing through institutions that are bigger than you are. I'm not sure that all of your leaders here have that, but I am absolutely sure that they don't have it in Europe. There is this extraordinary presumption, this belief that they have all the answers. When we drew up the European Constitution, unlike your founders, who had the modesty to limit themselves to some general principles, the European Constitution went into enormous detail about the rights of asylum seekers, the status of disabled people, the policy on space exploration. You know, your Declaration of Independence promises life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. The EU's equivalent, which is called the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, guarantees our right to strike action, free healthcare, and affordable housing. Now, there was a debate at the time of the framing of the Constitution of whether it should explicitly mention the Christian heritage of Europe. And I was thinking, well, you know, given the presumption of the authors of this document, of course they're not going to have the Almighty in there. There's no space for him. They've got all the answers. This is the Babel story come to life. They think that on their continent they can build and see into heaven. And that is a dangerous thing, coming back again to the politician who sees no constraint on his action because he is so confident in his own conscience. Save us from people like that.